Okay, welcome everyone to this evening's event, the final in our annual speaker series at the Wargaming Network here at King's. My name is David Banks. I'm the academic director of King's Wargaming Network. As I'm sure most of you know, King's Wargaming Network is an association of scholars committed to understanding and improving the epistemological and pedagogical foundations of wargaming as a method, as well as understanding wargaming's impact and effects in wider society. And so we have our guest today as part of our annual speaker series, the theme of which this year was evaluating and assessing the impact of wargaming on individuals and organizations. And we invited a number of speakers who made important new contributions to developing thought in these issues. I'm very happy to see that we have people joining us from across the world, as far afield as Melbourne, Australia, Boston, Arlington, Washington, DC, New York in the United States, Ghent in Belgium, across the UK and Sweden, and hopefully many more locations. I just want to make a quick announcement before I introduce our speaker and turn it over to her, which is that if you have questions during the course of the presentation, we're going to ask you to put them in the Q&A function that you should be able to see on your screen, not in the general chat. And then what we'll do is we'll answer the questions directly from that Q&A function after the presentation is over, and there should be plenty of time for those questions. So it just leaves me to introduce our speaker today, who is Natalia Wojtowicz, a lecturer at the Hague University of Applied Sciences in the Safety and Security Management Program. She teaches about wargaming, game design, and digital skills, and her research includes effectiveness of wargaming, new methods, and experimental implementation. Previously, she worked at the NATO Civil Military Cooperation Center of Excellence, leading the wargaming modeling and simulation project focused on introducing civilian population into training and education. Later, she designed 14 new wargames implemented across NATO. Currently, she is researching adjudication in wargaming and testing an upcoming game about uprising in Belarus. Her most recent book, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is Wargaming Experiences, Soldiers, Scientists, and Civilians, which covers the fundamentals of wargaming, as well as her experiences running games, most notably for NATO. So her presentation today, which is bang on the money for what we've been talking about over the last few months, is evaluating effectiveness in war games. And I turn it over now to Natalia, and I very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to speak more about evaluating effectiveness in war games. I will quickly share my presentation. And we can start up. First of all, when I received the invitation, I was thinking, what could we discuss that wasn't previously mentioned in the lectures? And I wanted to go into a couple of aspects of measuring effectiveness, and starting with the main question, who is keeping the score? Because if you ever played games as a hobby, probably you have the statistics, you know who is winning, losing, what are the different tendencies, and you would recognize directly whether the game is balanced or it is asymmetric. In professional or academic war games, this aspect, in my view, looks very different. And probably we are the ones that have to keep the score. I would like to look at 4 things. First of all, what kind of methods could be used to measure effectiveness, and also the structure that leads to conclusions. So the starting point very often already determines what we can conclude within the war game or afterwards. So I will show 3 examples of the same topic, but different structures, formats, and you will notice it is bringing us to a very different result. Because of that, I will also question objectivity within war games, which is usually the argument that comes up, but it was, in my view, never went into deeper. So what has to be more objective and how to achieve it? And finally, which next steps could be made for measuring and evaluating war games. First of all, probably you recognize this scientific method scale. And I brought this up because I think that many of the war games are not measured according to any scale. And often we find ourselves comparing pears and apples. So you would find very elaborate war games next to almost unstructured discussions trying to be compared together. But it would be very good to instead make different levels of inquiry and try to compare them that way. And that has been done previously for crime prevention. So you would start with level 1, which is the most basic and least reliable, and move up to the most advanced, but also the most reliable. As you can see on the slide, this is the difference between simple correlation and one point in time being measured to comparison before and after, but without any other control condition. And then moving into more advanced methods such as control units and also other variables that might be influencing the results, as well as looking at randomized trials. So that way you are able to see if this study only looked at one city and one district. At the month of May, we could see that the intervention was local and successful. However, if you compared it to winter and summer, you could see that there are varied levels of effectiveness. And the same for war games. So we could translate this kind of scale to a way of measuring our work. And I claim no rights that this is the universal standard, but I propose that if we start wargaming, the first level is to have just a working model, working simulation. So we would have one off game, we can conclude it works. This model is possible to develop into a war game, and we have anecdotal evidence from that war game. So we are able to see maybe this was an easy victory, maybe it was a very fast-paced scenario, but we could not bring higher level conclusions from that one prototype. If we go to level 2, I believe we could have multiple groups and we could also analyze the results. That means we are setting up a structure where we say it will be a group of 12 participants. They will have 30 minutes to decide. And that way, between groups, we can see the tendencies, what kind of decisions and how developed. Level 3 is we could look at intervention before and after. And I believe most of my colleagues wish for this holy grail, that we could pin the specific war game having an operational effect. Meaning, if planning was prepared with wargaming, we would know that the given group had a better plan for the given conflict. This is very difficult to translate to action, but it could be done, for example, in training groups. So we could measure levels of competence before the group plays and afterwards. And then we could say this was an effective game training-wise. Next level, we could see whether the war game is effective with the given group, but we could also set up a control with a different method. And that way we would see probably for some goals, war game is better. For some goals, it is worse than other methods. But unless we have the control group, we cannot compare it as a tool. And last level for me is if you would have a critical collection of identified lessons and update to the recent incidents. And the reason is when we draw conclusions, even with the control group, it can be that those conclusions get outdated due to real life developments. So this would be the most reliable wargaming. In that case, we have a lot of potential progress. What we must avoid is trying to compare level 1 with level 5, because that gives very distorted image about effectiveness of wargaming. So we should be striving to at least have the image of which level of measurement did we achieve within the given wargame. And it can be that level 1 is extremely valuable. So I'm not saying to immediately only do advanced wargames. However, we should avoid comparing pears and apples within long-term studies. So if I look at an example of these scales, probably you might recognize this image from the earlier book, which I realized today is already 2 years old. So I have to speed up on some of the writing for the next part. If I look at the example of Wargaming Baltics, level 1, we had a model that applied bowtie to a multi-ethnic city simulations. So if you look at the picture, we had 3 teams and we measured effectiveness of their actions based on interactions, looking if they didn't cancel each other out or if they could defend against each other. So level 1 was achieved, I would say, with the first group that tested it, and it was proven as workable model. So anecdotally, we could already say things about the scenario or the chances of winning. However, it was not representative of the situation. It was the one group story. It was later tested with 40 groups over 2 years. And at that point, we can run statistical analysis. We can say how many of the iterations ended in which result. So we can start drawing conclusions about trends within this wargame. Level 3, we have coded the results according to escalation rate. So I was curious about what would drive different teams into escalation mode, and also which winning conditions had to occur in order for the group to be successful. So the unit of the analysis were the actions. We would see which ones were more or less useful within this particular scenario. So if you look at 40 groups over 2 years and all of them produced between 10 and 15 actions, we have a data set that we can run through analysis. Level 4, we looked at not using this wargame. So if we had the goal of preparing groups for deployment, and we would compare different tools to do that, and we would have a control group that received a lecture instead, or they had to play instead other games, they had to read a book, different ways of preparing. And we would check which one left them with more knowledge about the region they were deploying to. And we could draw conclusions on the effectiveness in that way. And last level, we could, based on this broad database, look at the success rate of a given action. And we could say which tactics are more successful than others, giving the decision makers idea about what should be included in both information and training sessions, showing how these dynamics play out. So from level 1 of only seeing the working prototype to level 5, giving wargame-based information, it grows both in reliability and in a level of advancement. So this is important to map out which level can be reached in which situation. The other case is also this is one way of looking at wargaming. This is our academic scientific vision of what we want to achieve. So the point of reference is clearly validity and fidelity of the results. And you would also say that a lot of times academic staff measures the success by level of publications. So if we would be able to draw this analysis into an article and it would be viewed in a reputable journal, that would be a success for the academic staff. The problem with that in wargaming is there is generally a bias against wargaming that I have noticed, in a way that it is associated by people outside of wargaming with belittling the war setting and making it into fun game. So it is not seen as a serious simulation of the situation, which causes downgrading of wargaming to not being a discipline. And you can see a lot of authors that link wargaming into other disciplines that are more established and that way publishing. But it is quite rare to see articles that solely refer to wargaming. So science has a slight challenge in bringing the results that we are able to see on all levels to higher visibility to practitioners. But as I mentioned, this is not the only way of evaluating effectiveness of wargaming. I also want to speak about both commercial world and governmental organizations that use wargaming. So if I compare these basic 5 levels within academia and commercial companies, we would simply start with a pitch presentation. That would be step 1. So we have to see if the game gains traction, if it builds interest, if it is original enough to be considered for publishing, and if the topic is also interesting for people that would play it. After the pitch presentation, that usually in short way has to explain why this game is worth attention, we would move on to playthrough. So there has to be a prototype, and again, you could think about it as the same as with previous examples. We have to see if it works, but in that case, our judges will be the players. And if we see that we have individual interest, there would be focus groups playing it out, seeing what could be in here made either as a yes or a no in terms of publishers. And that would be the point of decision for development and further testing. If you look at the picture of Belarus 20 that has been in development since a year and a half, I believe we had more tests than the Baltic scenario you saw previously, precisely because there is more interest out there to play a game that would be about this topic with this mechanics and bringing it to the market. And after that process, last level is publishing, so either box or print and play version. And the outcome in that case are sold copies, the interest, the impact on gaming scene a lot of times. So if there is the first game of its kind, it would actually not only be important because it was well received by the market, but also because it brought something new. And this is where probably science should learn some humility, because if I look purely at the numbers, you see that videos such as our talk would gain around 1,000 views over 1-2 years, whereas playthroughs of commercial games get thousands of them. That means we could be learning about bringing more attention and urgency to scientific projects as the commercial publishers can do for games. And the main point of reference here is the player. So we would see how many people would get engaged with this war game. This is much less taken into account if we speak about scientific experiments. They rely more on collection of data and what can be concluded. So there are very different perspectives looking at effectiveness of a given war game. The last perspective that I would like to speak about is the governmental organizations. So again, this is based on the experience I have so far had, as well as speaking to other designers. If I translate the scale into governmental organization, the minimum that the wargame has to achieve is it has to address maximum amount of topics that are urgent. So the more can be included in the wargame that is currently a priority, the better for wargaming. Mostly governments also want to have multiple stakeholders. So it would also act as a central point for a given topic. Next level is it could provide insight into policy. So we would be able to see, again, which strategies work or what are the hotspots for a given area. If we are successful, it would also build a community of experts, meaning you would be able to see which part of the government is responsible for what problem. And if this is running, the employees would request more wargaming, and short-term projects would be established to fill that need. This means an effective wargame within the governmental realm. So if I look at an example, this year, the game came through, but we started working on it last year with the team of Dutch connections. We all thought Ukraine is going to be very important. So around November, we wanted already to play out a simulation of escalation. But as you know, government, it takes a while to get all of the things moving. So we ended up in February with the first game, later March and April following ones. And when we discussed the scope of the game, for us, it was very clear, we just need the situation within Ukraine and the fronts that would be developing. But we got a question whether we could include China. And at that point, you already probably recognize the danger of governmental perspective. And that is, on one side, the goal can be very thin, very low, saying we just want to try out a war game. On the other side, even that first version is heavy with content. So we might have very few conclusions because we attacked a lot of topics at the same time with first-time players. So that is, on one side, basic level. On the other, it has its dangers already at this stage. Level 2 is we could connect military with civilian experts. So that was a very good outcome for the government. And based on this combination, they were able to identify weak spots. So areas where government is not prepared and nobody is assigned to investigate how to fix it. That also leads to a network of expertise because we have a networking event within the wargames. And last level, if it is successful, participants would request further iterations. And that actually is one of the best forms because we are able to see again the differences. So we could be at that point going into more scientific study if that is continued. However, not only within my lecture, but also within the previous ones, I have to admit that governmental initiatives are short-lived and rarely institutional. So they don't have somewhere to land in or professionals that are assigned to it permanently. And that means it is always a cycle of approvals that might make it less effective for the organization. To sum up, the main point of reference, if I look at the differences between scientific, commercial, and governmental perspectives, is in science we want to achieve maximum fidelity and validity. And for that, we run longer studies that collect more data, and a lot of times the expected outcome would be a published article with the results, or in terms of applied sciences, a prototype that could be turned into a mass wargame. Commercially, that is the main point of reference, the viability on the market, and that would translate into both sales of the game for the publisher and impact of the given product. For government, I think we are still at the stage where wargaming has to defend its value. So the point of reference is proof of contribution. So every time a wargame is done, it has to be presented as to what it achieves with the iteration. And it helps with coordination or diagnosis of a problem. That is how I have so far experienced the three perspectives. Those forms also dictate the structure and the nature of the conclusions. So if we look at the more basic formats, of course, you cannot run data analysis on one iteration, or the conclusions would be very limited on that scope. That also means the conclusions that are reached are more anecdotal than long-term. So effectiveness is very different depending on the reference point. And the main question that I would ask in this case is, what does the wargame deliver? So structurally, there are a couple of variables I always look at if I'm preparing a wargame. And if we have the base, meaning either scenario or the information that is under the mechanics, if it is fictional, we directly take out a lot of conclusions that could be made about real life events. If we speak about reality, we have to look at the source of the information, but generally we would be closer to concluding anything about real life scenarios. Complexity is a big issue because we also have to look at capacity to play. So the more modules, the more topics we add, as with the example of Ukraine escalation and role of China, very different conclusions could be drawn based on these two topics separately and together. We also could think about difficulty of the game, meaning how is the scoring system built to ensure that it is realistic in terms of winning or losing. So we wouldn't give a false impression about the situation. Also the role of randomness, meaning if I make a system that relies on dice, this is the classic discussion of wargamers, I directly take away from the deterministic format. And I cannot say that the players failed due to their lack of skills, because I have created a system that promotes luck. We also have time to play, number of players, and interactivity, and all of those are dependent on the organizations that would be participating. And that also means if we have very limited time, we cannot do complex formats, which means we cannot take conclusions that would be multi-level as well. So if I take an example of the Baltic states, I've played it with the same scenario, but with different structures. And you can see 3 pictures. The first one was a complete matrix wargame, meaning open set of rules. Players have a very high possibility of proposing their own actions, and also the judgment within this format is very much group focused. So winning and losing is very much in the hands of the player, and there is almost no system that would prevent them from progressing. So it is very good for drawing potential strategies. We can see players either being successful or not, and we can say, given these circumstances, player 1 choosing aggressive strategy is not useful. We can draw some probabilities based on the knowledge of the participants and also vote for the most realistic outcome. So our score would be very qualitative and linked to the group at hand. The picture in the middle is the game I already mentioned, and that is the Baltics based on the bow-tie model. And in that case, we could go deeper into the value of the actions. We could look at the effects on targets. We could measure dynamics between actors. We could do a heat map with points that were the most in danger. And this could only be done because there are semi-opened rules. So we are able to collect the actions because it is written in the instructions for all the participants. That is very different than the first case. So our conclusions could be more structured. Last but not least, we wargamed Baltics on tactical level. So we would ask questions, for example, how long does it take to siege this capital? How long does it take to take over 3 critical bridges around it? And that means there is a closed set of rules. As you can see on the picture, potentially with this unit, you could move into that area, but not the other one. So you can cross a bridge, but you cannot do it just on the water. And the main result is, of course, the combat. We can see whether it is possible with given assets to achieve this objective. That means our score would be very literal. We would see who is winning and why, what is needed to change the proportions. So it is very useful for example, urban combat. We are able to calculate different ratios, but it will not draw out potential strategies and probabilities that game number 1 did. And it will also not deliver on dynamics between actors and heat map that game 2 did. So it is very important when thinking about measuring effectiveness, what is the set of conclusions you need to reach within your wargame. In this case, if I look at what was the score with open set of rules and matrix formats, we played it with 3 groups. First, civilian students from the Hague University, then military cadets, then government officials. So actually we got very close to the 3 perspectives I started with. And an interesting trend came out with the prediction rate. So if I looked at the actions proposed by the teams and real-life events that followed, so I give it, let's say, 30 days span to compare with day one of the wargame and D plus 30, I can notice that students of the Hague University had 75% correct prediction rate. Actions they proposed happened 75% of time. 25% was falsified, but 3/4 were correct. Cadets scored 30% and government 10%. What we have noticed in all three games, which we could call the fake data, was last round blowout. So if we would communicate, this wargame has 4 rounds and we will finish at 2 o'clock. 1:30, the last round, there will always be a team that tries extreme measures that are not realistic, which you might know from other wargames, but in that case, it is very important to put it in the structure that it will not be clear how many rounds are played. Otherwise, this unrealistic round will also be within your data set. We could also notice a bias of peace, meaning that was the perception within all three groups, that the end game would be a peace resolution, despite having teams in that scenario that consistently refused to either come to negotiations or they ramped up their aggressive stance. That means we have to look also at the group behavior and ask ourselves, what does that mean for decision makers? So it was a very important conclusion also, not only what the game confirmed, but also what it falsified. If I look at the Baltics, but with the bow tie model, we played it with both military and civilian professionals, but they were all within NATO, UN, EU. So I would rather say professionals within the defense area. And the first thing we measured was a success rate. So I wanted to know which team has an advantage when playing this scenario, but all three teams tied. So despite having many iterations, it would still come to a tie between the teams. And it also proved to us that it is not a won or lost scenario. It has a critical role of competence. So literally, the competence of the people that would be deployed decided the outcome for the area. That meant we really should have mapped competences for people that would be deployed. And it also falsified the sense of business as usual. One of the actions that was very ineffective, but was proposed 90% of the time, was military picnics. So it is the usual action to take when in allied territory. However, within countries that have high support for NATO, it had almost no effect because they didn't anymore have effect on the population. It also has shown that there are limits to reputation damage, mostly because Red Team would just ignore it. So they didn't have any obstruction of their normal work despite high damage to reputation. The other side, of course, Blue Team and White Team, that was at that time, humanitarian organizations put very high notice on it. So there was a missing balance between the strategies of the three groups, or at least the awareness that the other team normally behaves that way. And this game could model it very well. Last but not least, we had the tactical wargaming that was played exclusively with military. And this way we could look at the tempo of maneuver, we could look at rate of casualties within combat, chances of winning a given objective. So you could map how difficult it was on average to achieve that, and also potentially evaluate commanders on their actions. What was, in my view, falsified within that tactical wargaming is common skill. I have not seen that among international groups of military, we have average level of wargaming skills. Quite the contrary, sometimes they would struggle with level 1 wargaming. So it was important to provide many iterations, but also made me think that we could use more of wargaming within basic training. And there was also very low willingness to wargame, and I completely understand that if you choose between field tasks or combat training and wargaming is actually not as fascinating as the other ones. So again, it has to be proven as an effective tool, because it is a trade-off between time and effort compared to other training. So this has to be made clear which competences are improved and why. That also led to a study on objectivity, because on one side, when we design war games, we have some assumptions, we have some estimates, we have some data, but we also have quite a lot of choices and judgment. For example, if we come back to the 3 different formats, matrix games have a facilitator. So he would generally collect all of the actions, and he would propose probabilities of success. Often this is crowd-based, so we would have a bigger group that is judging the probability, but in the end, they would choose the number. And the question here could be, what is the basis of the decision? Is it their experience? Is it statistics? Is it current situation? How does this decision engine work? In terms of second game, it had a facilitator, but also data. So there was a database of incidents that happened in the area and their resolution. But you could still ask, what is the evidence behind the decision? You could ask which time span is included. You could ask which information sources were used. So it is not completely objective. And last but not least, with the tactical wargaming, there would always be questions about the rules that were set out. And even with ratios, there would be always a question, well, here there could be an exception, could be a different situation. Where are the numbers derived from? And we have the standard combat tables, but again, you could say, what about morale? You could add more factors that influence the outcome. So even rules only are not completely objective. They are our simplification of reality towards calculable outcome. So in that case, I started looking into experiments where we could compare the different methods and try to increase objectivity. So we would come to our scientific level 3 or 4, looking at different methods. In the first experiment, we had 3 war games. They were adjudicated by 3 different facilitators, and I chose different professional background, an officer, an NCO, and a civilian, also different nations, so we would have a different representation. They participated with the wargame, and we conducted the same scenario, and players chose precisely the same actions. So at the decision point, they did the same. What happened is we collected 3 completely different results. Not only how they reacted to this decision point, saying this will happen next, also feedback given to participants was different. Some of them referred to historical trends, some of them to recent events, some of them to technological developments. So you could see that the facilitator, I would not say that it was intentionally biased, but it was not an objective result either for the participants or for the data collected from the working. Second experiment, we compared 2 methods of adjudication of hybrid warfare. I know that this is a very needed topic. So we compared the traditional methods with potential new methods that would be used with the same game. So we have, again, same scenario, players do the same actions. And what we here noticed is not only the results were different, because they were, but participants of both groups noted need for more transparency. So again, they started asking, well, why is it this result? Why is it a yes? Why is it a no? Why is it 42? What is the evidence behind this judgment? And how can we see that it is objective? So there could be different factors influencing it, but the point remains the same. There has to be a critical look at objectivity, both in the design and in the facilitation of war games. Otherwise, we cannot compare whether the war game is effective and actually to what effect are we conducting it. And I also show this slide a lot with my talks. Those are the experiments that led to the NATO war games that are currently used. I have compared them based on their attributes. So I call this unnatural selection because you spawn a tree of possible solutions and then you test which one has the highest score. And some of these results surprised me. For example, facilitated in-person war games scored higher than computer-aided. And at the moment, it is considered a better standard to have distance war games because they are accessible to more people. However, what was clearly noted by the participants is computer-aided war games rarely provide any reasoning. So you would not know why your action resulted in this effect. And facilitated ones have the chance of debriefing and discussing why this is a better strategy. I compared also historical and current scenarios, and current had a slight advantage. With fictional and realistic scenarios, reality was highly more preferred and effective. And if I just look at those variables separately, they don't show me a very high difference. But if I sum them up, I see almost 30% of the total effectiveness. So the scale of this study was from 1 to 5. And if I see a difference of 1.8 at a higher scale, it is deciding whether my game achieves the effect or not. So sometimes it might be more useful to actually map out the factors that could be influencing effectiveness and run smaller tests over time to come to the right solution. And I wanted to shortly say a couple of words about next steps for measurement and evaluation. As mentioned before, I did sum up all of the results from my experiences within NATO in a book, and that focused on soldiers, scientists, and civilians. So they were the target groups that were playing war games or using them as a method of inquiry. However, at the moment, I'm more thinking about professionalization of wargaming. And there will be a new book edited by Sebastian Bay that will speak about forging wargamers, meaning how to proceed to higher levels of wargaming. And my article will speak about professionalization. The survey I conducted at US Connections has shown that among the audience that is interested in wargaming, only 5% of the participants would be professionally involved, meaning it is part of their function and they do wargaming within their job. And that is only, again, the start of it, because designers also need to be professionalized. And quite a contentious point that I made in this article is we need professional players. What it means is, if I look at the prediction rate between students, cadets, and government, it was visible that some people could be much more effective within that role as a player. So we shouldn't always have randomized groups. If we have a focus on a given region or topic, it should be possible to have players that are advanced and can handle higher complexity. That also means analysts that know how to extract meaningful results from work. So I propose that we should have a critical look at point of reference, because it is very different between scientific, commercial, and governmental organizations. And that also determines how we could measure effectiveness, and effectiveness to what. So that evaluation could be achieved first with mapping different levels of potential effectiveness, and then seeing how it can progress over time and over format, and also experimenting with different ones, because you see that conclusions drawn from different formats were in different classes. Their nature, their set was different. So the question would be rather not how to measure the effectiveness, but which effectiveness of war games we need to identify, and then later we can assign the parameters to that. And that was the short overview of my thoughts on measuring effectiveness, and I am open for questions. Thank you.
Sorry, playing with the machine as usual. Thank you very much for that talk. That was excellent, and really, I think, summed up, or really gave a really good overview of the different ways that we have to think about what effectiveness is in wargaming. I think that's one of the real great takeaways from this, is that we have to be careful about recognizing that it needs to be in the right, you need to be evaluating what it is you want the game for, the purpose of the game, and start there. But I also really appreciate your use of these different types of levels, so that for even for each of those standards, there's kind of better, or not better, but more advanced or more rigorous forms of evaluating what you're actually doing in those games. And so I'm thrilled to say that your talk generated a lot of interest from the attendees. And so I'm going to just jump straight in with some of the questions they have, and then maybe if there's time, I might ask you some that I have myself as well. So we have a question here from Marco. I'm going to start with this one, which gets back to your earlier slide on the scoring and the way you kind of score each of the different types of games. He proposes here another parameter. So he asks, what about the value, quote, strategic depth, unquote, which is a valuable parameter in choosing commercial or professional war games? Do you think it is a valuable tool assuming there's a non-quantitative or qualitative reference to this value?
I believe I have a question back. Strategic depth, does it mean number of players or topics, or what would that specifically be?
Marco, I wonder if you can quickly type into either the Q&A or the chat function what you mean by strategic depth. While you're doing that, I'm going to jump ahead again to another question, so we keep things flowing. This is from Evan, who's actually one of our MA students here at King's. Measuring accuracy of players to real-life events only measures how well the players got inside the head of real-life actors at the time. What other sorts of metrics can we use for evaluating accuracy when we are looking to train players to make good decisions or to test more radical future ideas and concepts?
Right, so indeed, the first metric would be prediction rate. And in that case, you are right. In a way, we are looking at a limited set of actions, and we can map them to the current events. So that heavily depends if you could predict black swans, if you could predict events that have ripple effects and low probability that we don't see normally. But wargames are very good in showing this kind of extreme events because, in my view, people are quite open to testing hypotheses that way. So you could technically think about it to also instruct players about their decision making. That, of course, again, takes away from objectivity because you are giving them lead into what you are looking for. However, you could, for example, instruct them about playing unconventional strategies or making alliances. So you could extract things that are not predicted with different methods. And different measurements, I would also think about not only prediction rate, but accuracy of the wargame in terms of choosing priorities. So if we have a number of topics and, for example, we can only execute 3 of them, was it correct? So you would judge the designer more than the participants. And I think that is important both to keep the diversity of topics, but also to assign later value to the wargaming as a method.
Okay, thank you. So Marco here has clarified what he meant by strategic depth. So I'm going to ask the question again with his specification here. So what about the value of strategic depth in choosing commercial or professional wargaming, where strategic depth is defined as a general complexity balanced to adherence to reality?
Yes, now I understand what you mean, Marco. So the case that I usually speak of is constructive complexity, meaning wargame should only be as complex as it is needed to analyze the topic or to the conclusions that need to be drawn. So in that case, strategic depth, that's how I understood your comment, would be actually necessary complexity that would make it worth to play it because you could reach these advanced conclusions, and you would have to judge it very carefully. So I am thinking how to evaluate that variable. Certainly we should add that to the list, because you could say that some of the aspects are only valuable for limited audiences or for all of them. So that would be interesting how to think about strategic depth in terms of both complexity but also value of the game. Because I can imagine if you would assign it as a positive sign of decision makers do have to spend this amount of time and effort, but the outcome is very valuable, then you could speak about that ratio and establish this as a way of choosing war games.
Okay, yeah, very good. Very interesting answer as well, because I think that is something that I realized more that it's really the complexity thing is something that's often sought more on the commercial side than actually sought on the professional side. I have a question here from an anonymous attendee regarding the confirmations and falsifications of a war game. Do you explore those in strategic pauses, in after action reviews, or both, and why?
I think both. So we do have observations about all groups, and that usually comes after we played through a number of iterations. Then you could see what are the things that generally hold true within the wargaming, but they are not true outside of it, and you could falsify things that are noticed. But we also have always debriefing, and you would discuss the actions as they unfolded, and then you could understand more the reasoning behind them. And in that case, you could think about why certain players act that way and what should be known about it within a strategic context. So in short, both, depending on which of the falsifications you would have to investigate.
Okay. Okay, so I have two questions here that are sort of linked, so I'm going to give you both of them. One is from the same anonymous attendee. Well, I don't know if it's the same anonymous attendee. It's an anonymous attendee. And another one is from Bukya, who's a PhD student here in the Wargaming Network. So the first question is, from your experience in wargaming with NATO, how do you assess the absorption capacity of insights derived from wargaming? And how did you approach this in designing and facilitating war games? And then sort of linked to this is, what are the key institutional barriers or opportunities you've identified for scaling up wargaming as an experiential learning tool in organizational settings? So kind of how are the organizations learning, and how can you make them want to learn more maybe?
So the first question, speaking about wargaming within NATO, the absorption capacity of insights, I would say that it has to be connected with the experience. So if we played out a war game and we came to the results, we are able to put these results in the context. So we can already say with the participants, this happens very often, or this was never seen before. And what does it mean for the collective and for the individual? So I would say generally the debrief should at least be the quarter of the wargaming time. So if we have 2 hours for a war game, half an hour afterwards should be spent on discussing the results. And I've never had any objection to that ratio. Quite the contrary, we used to have more and more questions to ask about the given scenario, the given background, the given decision making, or the longer study that was running. So I would recommend testing it out, but within NATO, that was a very good ratio. And if I look at the institutional barriers or opportunities for scaling up wargaming as a learning tool, I would say the biggest one is actually lack of institutionalization. So there is common practice of wargaming as either one-off or a short project. And in that case, I do agree with Dr. Wong that earlier said it, we lose more than we gain, because we are not able to continue both in terms of skills and knowledge, lessons learned, and also quick consistency. So when I was working within training and education in NATO, we had one war game that ran for 3 years. And that meant all of the personnel deploying to an area would receive a very clear simulation about the dynamics, but that ended after the project ceased. So the main barrier is actually lack of willingness to put it on the landscape, or simply speaking, having professionals that do it as a long-term appointment rather than short-term project. And as well, I would relate to, let's say, lack of progress, because we would have participants that only see a war game for the first time in their life, so already the level must not be too complex. However, if we would have the same players play second, third, fourth time, we could produce more advanced formats. So I would gladly see that as more a way of progressing than randomized participation. Both are valuable, but if we want to reach higher level conclusions, again, we need professional players. So that would be for me the two main barriers. The first one being lack of institutional support. Second would be lack of participants that could commit to more advanced formats.
And just based on your experience, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up here myself. Just based on your experience, then, what do you think, roughly speaking, amounts to enough participation on the part of the organization? Right? I mean, are you talking about a large game once a year, some small games throughout the year? Like, at what point do you think you feel participants in an organization are receiving sufficient gaming for it to be a sort of a valuable enterprise and something that's become institutionalized? Have you got any kind of personal experience about that?
Actually, I think we could reverse the question because I do believe wargaming on its own, it's not the goal. It's the question of wargaming is achieving. So let's say if we need an analysis of the current concept, that means we should have a sample big enough to represent that concept. Currently, I have a group that is preparing a wargame on multi-domain warfare. And in that case, you already need to include all the representatives of different domains. So it becomes a large war game if it's supposed to be realistic. And then the organizations must prepare their level of ambition for wargaming. Is it supposed to deliver testing capacity? Is it supposed to define the level of competence for the given teams and so on? So actually, I would never put a set number because that creates the impression that wargaming is the goal. So the goal has to be established to see how much wargaming has to be done in order to reach it. But I do see that at least quantitatively, when we wargamed with NATO, I did a simple breakdown of our target audience because I wanted to know what I could do. And then we saw that the traditional wargamers, I would say hex and counter wargamers, they were smaller than 5% of the overall population. Then we have 15% that had some experience with board games, so that helps with terminology, and 80% that only played social games before. So that already creates a very limited pool of participants you could involve in your complex games, or you are speaking about longer preparation time. So that would be a big question of what is the goal of the organization and which wargaming can be proposed to reach it.
It's an interesting point, but it also, I think, there's other questions I don't want to monopolize, but it does create an interesting dilemma of, you know, you don't want to have them wargame for the sake of wargaming. It should be purpose oriented, but at the same time, if they haven't had that experience, then you can't have them wargame when you find the purpose that needs a war game. There's obviously a bit of a tension there between training them just so they can know how to do it when a good question arrives. But yes, it's an interesting dilemma. Let me go back to some of the Q&A here. A question here from Paul. Could you talk more about professional players? Do you think there is room for wargaming instructors or coaches to bring those players on?
Yes, this is the case where if you would identify that there is a small pool of professionals within the organization that already have experience, or they don't, but they are very good in learning new rules system, of course, it makes the games much easier to run. And I would say there are two competences behind it. One is a player that can very well participate, and two, player that has a lot of knowledge on the topic that will be played. So one, there is less explanation time. Two, there is a higher probability they are able to propose realistic outcomes. So that might be very important for the open systems. And you could also run an experiment with the experienced and completely novice group, because I also looked at the groups that read the pre-wargame package and didn't. And there is a big difference in the outcomes to the positive side of those that prepare. So in that case, players determine also the level of conclusions you would be able to reach. And I also do see very important role of the coaches, meaning the person that's explaining the rules. It can be the difference between very successful wargame and complete fiasco. So especially if there is a complex system of rules, there must be a person that's naturally predisposed to explain it clearly. And I know a couple of very talented people that can and are extremely important to the wargame.
Yeah, very interesting point. Another question here from an anonymous attendee. Measuring player level of knowledge before and after a war game is appealing to me for its simplicity and broad applicability to educational games in the government. Do you have recommendations for how to capture player knowledge?
I think it can be as simple as a questionnaire measuring different learning objectives. So in that case, you could split it between knowledge. Very simple examples. So do you understand this concept? Are you able to explain that? Or you could also go deeper into skills. And that's where I found very interesting tendencies, because I introduced a wargame as an evaluation tool at the university in one of the courses. So I do think most universities rely on written reports and assignments quite a lot. And I tried to do a wargame that would contrast the results for students between writing and doing. So the wargame was a decision-making exercise. And what I have found is actually students that are very good in writing and analytical skills were very bad in decision-making, and the other way around. So students that generally would not say that academic writing is their highest skill were very good in the fieldwork simulated one. So that made me also think that we must bring back this balance of practice and theory also within assignments. Otherwise, we are promoting only half of the skills necessary to be a practitioner or less. So I would think about measuring this knowledge either in terms of testing, or if you are speaking about skills, you could do observation. And then it is very important to give specific feedback on which of the displayed skills were lacking or were excellent.
Yeah, that's a really interesting finding. Are you going to publish that, or are you writing that up at all?
I am thinking about it because there's a lot of evidence that supported it, and I simply didn't consider it before doing this alternative assignment. So on the positive side, it led to much more alternative assignments that we are introducing now. But on the negative side, I didn't have any time to start writing about it.
Yeah, and I think it also, interestingly, it gets to a really interesting point you mentioned about the different purposes, right? From academia's perspective, we want good analytic writers, but that may not actually be what you want to produce out of an academic setting into professionals and careers in wargaming, right? That's not the same thing. There's a comment, really, as much as a question from Ron. He's pushing back on one of your claims here about lack of institutional support on wargaming. He says here, wargaming is a mainstream activity at many staff colleges, institutions like the USMC University, the Naval Postgraduate School, who run regular courses on analytic wargaming design at Joint Warfare Centre in Norway, and places like the Australian Defence Force Academy. He contends that the 5% figure you quote reflects the actual percentage of military staff employed at staff colleges. and is not high compared to militaries at large. So what is your thoughts on that?
I also find it very interesting that the demand is high and it is speeding up. So you see more and more wargaming. However, you don't see more departments or institutions focused on it, which made me think 2 points. One is it is still depending on external support, delivering wargaming. And second, there should be generally more and more percentage, as Ronald said. However, the study I did was based on the NATO groups that would fill the questionnaire before doing the wargaming, which meant they should count as their first experience, bringing the percentage higher. So I should repeat that study and see what do we have after 5 years. Because I do like to think I contributed to the change in this manner.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A question here from Kat at UNDCO. What makes for a good wargaming objective or question? Could you suggest some criteria?
Yes, and I think it's also quite transparent whether we can achieve the objective with a given format. So I would say one of the classic ones that I cite in different talks is a case of a new policy that we tested on the area that it was supposed to be implemented in. And based on the experience of different groups, there was a 95% failure rate. Meaning using this policy was actually very dangerous in these circumstances. So you could say, in that case, the criteria for the wargame was, we want to see if it is realistic, that under these conditions, the concept would be successful, because later you could look at the human factor, you could look at decision-making, you could look at many things, but we wanted to see whether the objective is reached, and it was not, and it was actually bringing the participants into worse situation and dangerous conditions. So in that case, if you are looking for a specific objective, it should be a question you can answer with the format you have chosen. Another good example would be a study. It was a master's thesis about a response to downing a plane or a drone. And then within groups of civilian and military experts, there was a question whether there should be a follow-up action, either retaliation or evacuation of the personnel. And of course, you can instinctively think the response would be very clear for the drones and so much for the manned aircraft. And the study was able to see what would be the responses within different groups, comparing military, civilians, lower, higher ranks. So it is a very clear objective to reach, but those are, of course, mostly scientific or training objectives. So you could also set out different ones, meaning if you want to have engagement on a given topic, objective could be as simple as reaching a number of players that were able to participate. I think the most important part is that you can check whether it was reached. So that's how I would think about the criteria.
Okay, so whatever objective you pick, just make sure you can measure success or failure on that dimension.
That is the difficult part, where actually maybe there is a change needed in the format to come to the conclusion. So if it looks blurry, potentially the format needs changing.
I have a question of my own, which I'm going to ask here because it builds on something you just said there, which is that in the most of your presentation and your kind of evaluation of gaming, as I understand it, so correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you said, is really about sort of understanding decision making, which seems to be a very prominent way that games are typically used, especially when, you know, we're trying to sort of push for scientific understandings of how the method works, right? Is that there's some sort of way here where we look at decisions And then we kind of see these as being sort of representative or externally valid or in some way about what decisions would be like in the real world. However, that example you gave there of the first one was a policy analysis, right, where the players are making decisions which matter, but the objective that's being evaluated is this a good policy or not, right? Which is really not only a question of decisions, but also a question of system dynamics. So I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are about the degree to which gaming can be used as a way of evaluating outcomes as opposed to just decisions, right? That is to say, how a system operates or how something is going to occur as an event, and whether you think A, that's possible, and B, does that generate, what kind of methodological difficulties that generates.
I might also give a controversial answer, but I will say I have not yet seen a ceiling. So I have not encountered a situation where I would say we cannot answer this with a war game, because I think about wargaming more as a laboratory. So it is a proxy of the reality, and we are able to play out many different aspects, and there has to be reality check and there has to be feedback loops. So we are able to see that it is not a false modeling. But on the other side, I have not yet met something I couldn't wargame.
So you don't think it's a problem that you're wargaming systems rather than decision makers in systems?
I do think both need feedback loops. So as I said, if we had 3 groups playing the same scenario, they had very different prediction rates. So we couldn't make a higher conclusion saying, overall, it is possible to predict what happens in this situation, but we could say those actions were predicted at the time and which groups are more successful in prediction of that question. And every model, of course, is not perfect, but you can get pretty close to the dynamics that are being observed. And then you could also measure it at points, saying, is it always true? Is it true in these circumstances? Is it false in others? So that would be actually progressing on the levels we spoke about, from this anecdotal evidence to systemic theories at the end. Okay,
great, excellent. So just a few final questions here in the limited time we have. Another one here from Marco, which is, did you use stress inoculation techniques like time pressure, strange situations, and so on testers, military and civilian, during the development of war games? If yes, did you ask the psychologist to measure the response of the players?
Yes, we used both the time pressure as well as injects that would raise the stakes within the middle of the analysis to see what would be the reaction. But in that case, it must be related to the objectives. I do remember that I played once a war game that did a false limitation on discussion, and they tried to conclude there is problem with communication. But I responded, I don't think we had problem communicating, we had limited time. But that was also the rule of the war game. So we have to be very careful about placing this, as you said, pressure where it belongs. So it should be only related to the given objective and to the realistic situation. One of the objectives that we had was, for example, multitasking. So if there has to be different decisions at the same time and you have different sources of information that you have to filter, would you be able to choose the right solution? And that was realistic to, for example, analyst rooms that are filled with different sources of information. I did not work with a psychologist to measure the response. So this was simply a factor of within the given limitation, is the task still successful? But it would be very interesting to involve somebody that could say more. But my follow-up question would be, what more do I want to know? So I would have to think about that.
Okay. Two more questions. So let's see if we can get them both in. I'll do Buka's one first. In facilitating war games, how have you navigated organizational culture and biases to allow for innovative and disruptive ideas to emerge in response to challenges?
So the question would be how to avoid crowd thinking?
I think if I'm interpreting it correctly, it means how can those new results or those interesting outputs from a game get past maybe the status quo bias that organizations have. They don't want to necessarily hear the news.
I think it is very important to early catch the biases, as one of the examples with the peace bias within our groups that we noticed. And it's also important to measure if your wargame is still bringing original insights. So that is also one of the points of should the collection of data go on or should you close the wargame? And within playing the Baltics bowtie model, we reached that point after around 18 months. So we would play the wargame and all the actions would repeat. So in short, we didn't have any new original actions anymore. That meant potentially we will not find anything new. And at that point, you could think about it. Do we have now the closed set? The model is complete. Or indeed, do we just not have the right groups to play with that could bring in new actions? And in this case, it is important to try to change the groups, change the setting, and that way we see where the bias was. I do remember we had an American participant that would suggest an action in the Baltics that related to a school shooting. And of course, for an American person, this is a very realistic and painful scenario that they can run through. However, for the Baltics, it never happened. So at that point, we had to do a reality check saying it is technically possible. However, realistically, it would be very difficult to see that event happening. So it is important on both sides, and that's why I was spending more time on objectivity of adjudication, that we have to think what is the source of the judgment and how do we bring in the information into the war game. So on one side, not to disqualify different points of view, and on the other side, still keep up the diversity of insights with realistic outcomes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Very, very interesting. It is so interesting to hear how your experiences inform so much of this, right? It's clear that you've just done this so many times that you really have a really good understanding of these different challenges. We're going to finish here. One last question here from Marco, which I think would interest a lot of people who think that, simulation can possibly replace wargaming. He's an ethical committee in an international. He's on an ethical committee in an international organization, and what scares him most is the possibility of AI making decisions. So, have you tested decision-making process of humans against AI, and in particular, he's interested on nuclear matters?
Actually, I have a planned experiment that compares human and machine decision-making. So I want to come back to this comparison of same scenario and same setting, but the decision maker would be human or not. What is a bit keeping me calm is the format of AI that is currently used. And if I look at wargaming, I assume you are speaking about enemy modeling and how that would play out. I have not seen yet intelligence. So we see a lot of artificial elements, we see a lot of run-through scripts, but I haven't seen an optimal strategy coming out of an artificial intelligence yet. However, you could also speak about levels of control. and automatization of response. And that applies both to humans and machines. And I'm also very interested in the nuclear aspect. And of course, in the past, we had the escalation ladder that went up to full annihilation with different steps. And I think at the same time, we should be looking at triggers and potential drivers of escalation currently. So it has become a much bigger puzzle. And I would say humans worry me more than AI in wargaming if I compare them. And I would like to see a critical analysis of what could go wrong using both. So I have a lot of new ideas that this discussion brought me.
Absolutely. This was a very, very interesting presentation and Q&A, and I think it was a great way for us to finish our series. So I just want to take this moment to thank you so much, Natalia, for your presentation. Really looking forward to seeing your upcoming research. It sounds really, really interesting. And I encourage everyone to read Natalia's book, which gives great insights into the way that she's used games and the way that games have been received by people in the professional and military worlds. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you everyone for attending and for the excellent questions. That's it for the King's Wargaming Network for this academic year. We will be publicizing our new events and speaker series in the upcoming few months. So we ask you to keep your eye on our Twitter feed and our various channels of communication. But in the meantime, final thanks to Natalia, and good luck to everyone, and have a great summer.
Thank you very much.
Bye.